Beginning. Because you need to understand how a marriage that seemed perfect from the outside became the most calculated game of chess I've ever played. And how the man who thought he'd won everything actually signed away his entire future with one arrogant signature. I met Marcos when I was 22, fresh out of college with a degree in finance. He was 25, working as a junior architect at a small firm, full of passion and big dreams about designing innovative buildings that would change cityscapes. He talked about architecture the way poets talk about love, with this intensity that made you believe anything was possible. I was captivated, not just by his vision, but by his drive, his determination to be somebody. We got married a year later. Small ceremony, just family and close friends. We couldn't afford anything elaborate. Marcos was still climbing the ladder at his firm, and I was working as a financial analyst at a mid-sized investment company. We lived in a tiny apartment, ate ramen, more nights than I'd like to admit, but we were happy. Or at least, I thought we were. Our daughter Sophie came along when I was 24. Marcos was thrilled, but also terrified about finances. So I did what seemed natural at the time. I took on freelance consulting work from home, managing books for small businesses while caring for Sophie. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough, and I could set my own hours. 2 years later, our son David was born. By then, Marcos had been promoted to senior architect, and things were starting to look up financially. But he was also working longer hours, traveling more for projects, becoming increasingly absorbed in his career. I understood. Someone had to be home with the kids, and someone had to chase the dream. We'd agreed I'd be the stable one. When I was 28, Marcos made a decision that would change everything. He wanted to start his own architectural firm. The risk was enormous. We had 2 small children, a mortgage on a modest house we'd just bought, minimal savings. But Marcos was convinced this was his moment. He needed me to believe in him. So I did. I liquidated my retirement account, $85,000 I'd been building since college. I took that money and handed it to my husband to fund his dream. "We're partners," I told him. "Your success is our success." Chen & Associates Architecture opened in 2011. For the first 3 years, it was brutal. Marcos worked constantly, chasing clients, building a reputation, competing against established firms. Money was tight, terrifyingly tight. There were months we weren't sure how we'd make the mortgage payment. I managed the firm's finances, working essentially as his unpaid CFO while still consulting on the side and raising 2 kids. I handled the books, managed payroll for the 3 employees Marcos eventually hired, dealt with vendors, chased down payments from clients. I did everything except the actual design work. And slowly, gradually, the firm started to succeed. Marcos landed a major commercial project when I was 32, then another, then several more. By the time I was 35, Chen & Associates was one of the most sought-after architectural firms in the city. Marcos was winning awards, getting featured in design magazines, being invited to speak at conferences. We moved into the mansion when I was 36. Marcos had designed it himself, his masterpiece. 6 bedrooms, 5 bathrooms. A home office that was bigger than our first apartment, situated on 2 acres in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city. It was valued at $3.2 million and it was stunning. Everyone who saw it called it a work of art. Marcos loved telling people he'd built it with his own vision and determination. He rarely mentioned that my inheritance from my father, who'd passed away when I was 35, had provided the $800,000 down payment. That detail always seemed to slip his mind at parties. As the business grew, Marcos changed. Not suddenly, but gradually, like ice forming over a pond. One day you're walking on water, the next you're breaking through. He started talking about my company instead of our company. He introduced me as my wife Helena instead of as his partner. At industry events, I became arm candy, instead of collaborator. The criticism started around the same time. Small things at first. You should update your wardrobe, Helena. Image matters in this business. Maybe you could lose a few pounds. We're going to that gala next month. Why don't you do something? With your hair? You're starting to look your age. I was 38 years old, had given this man 2 children and 16 years of my life, and he was telling me I wasn't pretty enough anymore. But I adjusted. I got the wardrobe. I joined the gym. I colored my hair. I tried to be what he wanted. Because that's what you do in a marriage, right? You adapt. What I didn't realize was that Marcos wasn't trying to improve me. He was preparing to replace me. The signs were there, but I didn't want to see them. The late nights that became later. The business trips that lasted longer. The phone calls he took in another room. The way he stopped touching me. Stopped really looking at me. Stopped seeing me at all. I found out about Caroline on a Tuesday evening, 2 years ago. I was 40. Marcos had left his laptop open in his home office, and I saw the messages. Months of messages. She was 29, worked as a designer at his firm, and they'd been seeing each other for nearly a year. I sat in that office for 3 hours, reading everything, the intimate messages, the plans they'd made, the places they'd been, the lies he'd told both of us. And then I closed the laptop, went downstairs, and made dinner like nothing had happened. You might wonder why I didn't confront him immediately, why I didn't scream, throw things, demand answers. The truth is, I'd spent 18 years managing finances, analyzing numbers, looking for patterns and problems, and in that moment, sitting in Marcos's office, I realized I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with before I made any moves. Over the next several weeks, I did what I do best. I investigated. I went through every file, every account, every document related to Marcos's business and our personal finances. And what I found made my blood run cold. The mansion we lived in, the one Marcos had designed, the one everyone admired, had been mortgaged 3 times. The original loan of $2.4 million. A second mortgage of $900,000 taken out 3 years ago. A third mortgage of $850,000 taken out 18 months ago. Total owed $415 million on a property worth $3.2 million. We were underwater by nearly $1 million. The business was even worse. Chen and Associates looked successful from the outside, but the books told a different story. Outstanding business loans, $1.8 million. Lines of credit maxed out, $600,000. Unpaid vendor bills, $400,000. Back taxes owed to the IRS, $275,000. The company that everyone thought was thriving was drowning in $3,275 million in debt. Even the cars weren't real. The Tesla and the BMW were both leased with balloon payments coming due. We owned nothing. We just had extremely expensive obligations. I sat with these numbers for days, trying to understand where all the money had gone. And then I found it. The offshore account. The one Marcos thought was hidden in a corporate structure so complex that no one would ever trace it back to him. Over 5 years, Marcos had been siphoning money from the business. Nearly $2.3 million had disappeared into investments that had failed spectacularly. Cryptocurrency ventures that crashed, real estate deals in markets that collapsed, high-risk stocks that tanked. He'd been gambling with our future, losing consistently, and hiding it from everyone, including his own accountants. There was also the apartment, a luxury condo downtown, $8,000 a month, where Marcos had been keeping Caroline. 18 months of rent, plus furnishings, plus her clothing allowances, plus the jewelry I'd seen in the photos. Another $250,000 gone. My husband hadn't just been unfaithful. He'd been systematically destroying our financial future while presenting a facade of success to the world. And I was the only person who knew the truth. My first instinct was rage. Pure, burning rage. I wanted to confront him, to expose him, to watch him squirm as I laid out every lie, every betrayal, every hidden debt. But then, my financial training kicked in. Rage is emotional. Revenge is strategic. I had one major asset that Marcos didn't know about, couldn't access, and would never think to look for. My mother had passed away when I was 38, leaving me an inheritance of $1.4 million. Her will was explicit. This money is for Helena alone, earned through her father's and my life's work. It is not marital property. I'd kept it in a separate account, never commingling it with our joint finances, never using it for household expenses. For 2 years, it had just sat there, growing, slowly in conservative investments. I'd told Marcos about it, but he dismissed it as your little nest egg, barely worth his attention compared to his business empire. That little nest egg was about to become my salvation. I consulted with my aunt, a retired estate attorney, and we created an irrevocable trust. My inheritance went into that trust, designated specifically for Sophie and David's education and future. My name wasn't on it as a beneficiary. Marcos's name certainly wasn't. The trust was managed by my aunt as trustee, completely separate from our marital finances. Then I did something that would prove crucial later. I documented everything. Every hidden account, every mortgage document, every debt, every suspicious transaction. I photographed files. I downloaded statements. I created spreadsheets showing the flow of money. I saved everything to an encrypted drive and stored copies with my aunt, and in a safety deposit box Marcos didn't know existed. And then, I waited. I knew Marcos would leave eventually. Men like him always do. They get bored, or they get confident enough to think they can upgrade, or they convince themselves they deserve better. I just had to be patient and be ready when the moment came. For 2 years, I played the role of devoted wife. I smiled at his business dinners. I attended his award ceremonies. I stood beside him at galas while he networked, and I became invisible. I watched him text Caroline under the table during our anniversary dinner. I pretended not to notice when he came home smelling like her perfume. And all the while, I watched him dig the hole deeper. More loans, more mortgages, more bad investments, more money disappearing into his secret account, more lies stacked on top of lies. Marcos was building a house of cards, and I was waiting for the inevitable wind. Sophie and David noticed things weren't right. They were teenagers by then, 16 and 14, old enough to sense tension even when we tried to hide it. But I couldn't tell them what I knew, couldn't burden them with the knowledge that their father was a liar and their family's entire life was built on debt. "Are you and Dad okay?" Sophie asked me one evening. We were in the kitchen, just the two of us. She had her father's dark eyes, but my practical nature. "Why do you ask?" I said carefully. "You seem sad, and Dad seems somewhere else, like he's not really here anymore." I hugged my daughter and lied to protect her. "We're fine, sweetheart. Marriage is complicated. Adults go through phases." She hugged me back, but I could tell she didn't quite believe me. 16-year-olds are perceptive. They see what we try to hide. But she trusted me enough not to push further. The end came on a Monday morning, 6 months ago. I was in the kitchen making breakfast when Marcos walked in, already dressed for work. He poured himself coffee, didn't look at me, and said 5 words that would change everything. "Helena, I want a divorce." I turned, slowly from the stove. My heart was pounding, but I kept my face neutral. "What?" "I want a divorce." He said it matter-of-factly, like he was discussing a business transaction. "This isn't working anymore. We've grown apart. I think we both know it's time to move on." There was no apology in his voice, no sadness, No acknowledgement of 20 years together, of 2 children, of everything we'd built. Just cold, clinical detachment. I almost admired his efficiency. Almost. "I see," I said quietly. "And what exactly are you proposing?" "I keep the house and the business. You get reasonable spousal support and we split custody of the kids." He finally looked at me then, and his eyes were empty. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. I'll have papers drawn up. This can be amicable if we both want it to be." Reasonable spousal support. After 20 years. After funding his dream with my retirement. After managing his finances for free. After raising his children and supporting his career and standing beside him at every milestone while he took all the credit. "And if I don't agree?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Marcos set down his coffee cup and looked at me like I was a stubborn client refusing a generous offer. "Then we do this the hard way. But Helena, you should know. I've prepared for that too. My lawyers are very good. You won't win." The threat was clear. Fight me and lose everything. Accept my terms and at least get something. He was so confident, so certain he held all the power. He had no idea that I'd been preparing for this conversation for 2 years. That I knew exactly how deep his debts ran. That I understood his game better than he understood it himself. I could have confronted him right then. Could have laid out everything I knew and watched his face crumble. But that wasn't the plan. The plan required patience. The plan required letting him think he was winning. So I nodded slowly and said, "I'll need some time to think about this." "Of course." Marcos picked up his coffee, already mentally moving on. "Take a few days. But Helena, don't make this difficult. For the kids' sake." For the kids' sake. The man who was about to blow up their family, who'd been cheating for 2 years, who was now demanding everything we'd built together, was telling me not to make things difficult for the children. I should have won an Academy Award for my performance that morning. I made it through breakfast. Made it through getting the kids off to school. Made it through Marcos leaving for work with a brief, impersonal goodbye. And then I sat down at the kitchen table in our $3.2 million mansion that we were $1 million underwater on. And I smiled. Let the game begin. The divorce papers arrived 3 days later. Delivered by courier, thick envelope, official and intimidating. Marcos's lawyer was Richard Brighton, one of the most aggressive divorce attorneys in the city. Expensive, ruthless, known for crushing opponents. Marcos had chosen him specifically to intimidate me. I read through the proposed settlement carefully, analyzing every clause like I was reviewing a balance sheet. Marcos would retain sole ownership of the family home and Chen & Associates architecture. I would receive $80,000 in cash settlement, shared custody of Sophie and David, and spousal support of $3,000 monthly for 5 years. After that, nothing. $80,000 after 20 years of marriage, after funding his business, after managing his finances, after giving up my career to support his. It was insulting. It was probably also the best offer I'd get if I actually fought him in court, given how well Marcos had hidden his assets and debts. But I wasn't planning to fight. I was planning something much better. I hired an attorney, Patricia Moreno, 58 years old, sharp as broken glass, with a reputation for creative legal strategies. She came recommended by my aunt, who'd worked with her on estate cases. Patricia had a no-nonsense approach that I appreciated, immediately. We met in her office and I laid out everything. The full financial picture, the hidden debts, the offshore account, the mortgages, the business loans, the complete disaster that was Marcos Chen's empire. I handed her copies of every document I'd gathered over 2 years. Patricia reviewed everything in silence for nearly an hour. When she finally looked up, her expression was carefully neutral. "Mrs. Chen, you understand what you're sitting on here?" "I do." "Your husband is essentially bankrupt. The house alone is underwater by almost $1 million. The business is drowning in debt. If this went to court, If everything came out, you'd both walk away with nothing except shared liability for his financial disasters. I know. Patricia leaned back in her chair, studying me. So why did you come to me? What exactly do you want? I met her eyes steadily. I want to accept his offer, give him everything he's asking for, the house, the business, everything, in exchange for my settlement and a complete release of liability. There was a long silence. Patricia's expression shifted from professional neutrality to something close to admiration. You want him to assume all the debt. Everything. When he signs for the assets, he signs for the obligations. The mortgages become his sole responsibility. The business debts transfer entirely to him. All of it. I walk away clean. And your settlement? $80,000 is fine. I'll also request the furniture. From our old house. The one before the mansion. It's in storage. Sentimental value. I didn't mention that those items were worth about $30,000 in antiques my mother had left me. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Chen, I have to ask, are you certain about this? You're entitled to fight for more. We could potentially negotiate a better settlement. I don't want to fight, I said simply. I want this over quickly and cleanly. I want Marcos to have exactly what he asked for. Patricia smiled. Then, a slow, dangerous smile. You've been planning this for a while, haven't you? 2 years. What about the children? Your inheritance? Already protected in an irrevocable trust. Marcos never paid attention to it. Thought it was too small to matter. The kids' education and future are secure. And he has no idea what he's actually inheriting. None whatsoever. Patricia opened a fresh legal pad and picked up her pen. Then let's make sure every document is absolutely airtight. When this man realizes what he's done, he's going to try to fight. We need to make it impossible. Over the next 3 weeks, Patricia crafted the most beautiful legal trap I'd ever seen. The divorce settlement appeared straightforward and favorable to Marcos. He would receive all marital property, including the residence, the business, and all associated assets. In exchange, I would receive my modest cash settlement, shared custody, limited spousal support, and complete release from any liability associated with said assets. That last part was the key. Complete release from liability. When Marcos signed for the house, he assumed sole responsibility for all mortgages against it. When he signed for the business, he assumed all business debts, loans, and tax obligations. Everything transferred to him, and only him. Patricia attached a comprehensive asset and liability disclosure to the settlement agreement. Every mortgage was listed. Every business loan was documented. Every debt was laid out in black and white. It was all there, perfectly legal, perfectly clear. All Marcos had to do was read it. But Marcos didn't read things carefully. He skimmed. He trusted his lawyer to catch problems. He assumed that if something was being offered to him, it must be good. That assumption was about to cost him everything. Richard Brighton, Marcos's attorney, actually did try to review the documents thoroughly. He called Patricia 2 weeks before our settlement hearing. Patricia, I'd like to request a complete financial audit before we finalize this. The liability disclosure is extensive. I want to verify all figures. Patricia kept her voice professional. Of course, Richard. We'll provide any documentation you need. But I should mention that my client is eager to resolve this quickly. She's willing to accept very favorable terms to avoid a prolonged battle. Still, I'd feel more comfortable if... Marcos apparently overheard this conversation from Richard's office. I learned about it later from Patricia, who heard it from Richard. My soon-to-be ex-husband cut off his own lawyer mid-sentence. No audits, no delays. She's giving me everything I want. Why would we waste money on accountants? Richard pushed back. Mr. Chen, I strongly advise. I said no. Marcos's voice was firm. I built that business. I know exactly what it's worth. I'm not paying thousands for some auditor to tell me what I already know. Caroline wants this finished. I want this finished. We're moving. Forward. Caroline. I'd almost forgotten about her. The 29-year-old designer who thought she was getting a successful architect and a mansion. She was about to get something very different, but she didn't know that yet. Neither did Marcos. Richard Brighton did what any good lawyer would do when a client refuses advice. He prepared a document, a legal waiver stating that he had recommended an independent financial review of all assets and liabilities, and that Marcos Chen was declining this recommendation against counsel's advice. Richard had Marcos sign it, dated and witnessed. That waiver would become the nail in Marcos's coffin. The legal proof that he'd been advised to investigate had refused, and had assumed the risk voluntarily. Patricia kept 3 copies. Meanwhile, I played my part perfectly. I became the broken wife everyone expected to see. I moved into a small rental apartment with Sophie and David, a modest 2-bedroom place in a decent neighborhood. Nothing like the mansion, but clean and safe and ours. Sophie was 18 now, about to start college. David was 16, dealing with the divorce the way teenage boys do, with silence and video games and carefully hidden hurt. They saw their father's new girlfriend, young and bright and enthusiastic. They saw him moving on while their mother struggled. They didn't understand yet, but they would. I showed up to mediation sessions with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands. I spoke softly, hesitantly, like a woman who'd lost all her confidence. I just want this to be over, I told the mediator. I don't have the energy to fight anymore. Marcos can have what he wants. I just need enough to start over. The mediator, a kind woman named Susan, who'd probably seen 1,000 divorcing couples, looked at me with sympathy. Mrs. Chen, you understand that you're entitled to half of the marital assets? You helped build that business. You have rights. I just want peace, I whispered, dabbing at my eyes with a tissue. 20 years is a long time to fight. I'm tired. Marcos watched this performance from across the table. I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not quite guilt, but maybe a shadow of it. Maybe some small recognition of what he was doing. But Caroline was waiting at home in our mansion, redecorating my bedroom, planning their future. The guilt didn't last long. The final hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning. June 14th, 9 o'clock, Family Court, Judge Robert Morrison presiding. I remember every detail of that morning with perfect clarity. I wore a simple navy dress, minimal makeup, my hair pulled back in a practical bun. I looked tired, defeated, like a woman who'd given up. Marcos wore one of his expensive suits, the charcoal Tom Ford that cost $4,000. He looked confident, successful, like a man about to close a very favorable deal. Richard Brighton looked uncomfortable. He'd done his job, protected his client legally, but I could tell he thought Marcos was making a mistake. Patricia sat beside me, perfectly calm, her briefcase containing copies of every document that would matter in about 30 minutes. Judge Morrison reviewed the case file briefly. Chen versus Chen. Final settlement hearing. I understand the parties have reached an agreement? Richard stood. Yes, Your Honor. My client, Mr. Chen, will retain all marital property, including the family residence and his architectural firm, Chen and Associates. In exchange, Mrs. Chen receives a cash settlement of $80,000, 5 years of spousal support at $3,000 monthly, shared custody of their minor son, and complete release from all liabilities associated with marital assets. Patricia rose beside me. That's correct, Your Honor. My client agrees to all terms. Judge Morrison looked at me carefully. He was older, probably near retirement, and he'd clearly seen his share of imbalanced settlements. Mrs. Chen, I need to confirm you understand what you're agreeing to. You're relinquishing substantial property rights? Are you certain this is acceptable? I nodded, keeping my voice soft. Yes, Your Honor. I just want this to be over. I don't want to fight anymore. My husband built that business. He should have it. You're represented by counsel in entering this agreement voluntarily? Yes, Your Honor. The judge studied me for another moment, clearly wondering if I was being coerced or if I was simply too worn down to fight. But I was answering clearly. I had legal representation, and I was an adult making my own choice. He couldn't protect me from what he might have thought was a bad decision. Very well, let's proceed. The clerk distributed the final documents, page after page of legal language, requiring signatures every few pages. Marcos signed quickly, barely glancing at what he was agreeing to. He wanted this done. He wanted to get back to Caroline and their new life together. I signed slowly, carefully, reading every clause even though I'd memorized them all. This was the moment I'd been waiting 2 years for. Every signature was deliberate, controlled, savoring the knowledge of what was about to happen. Across the courtroom, Richard Brighton was doing what good lawyers do. He was reviewing the complete document package one final time before the judge made it official. Main settlement agreement, signed. Asset transfer schedule, signed. Custody arrangement, signed. Then he reached the attached disclosure statement. Comprehensive liability schedule. I watched his face as he read. Watched the confusion appear. Watched him flip back to verify what he was seeing. Watched him realize exactly what his client had just signed. Richard's face went pale. He leaned toward Marcos, trying to maintain discretion. Mr. Chen, he whispered urgently, we need to talk, now. Marcos waved him off, still basking in his victory. Not now, Richard. We're almost done. Sir, please. Richard's voice had genuine alarm in it. The liability disclosure. You're assuming... Whatever it is, it can wait 10 minutes. Marcos was impatient, annoyed at his lawyer for interrupting his moment of triumph. Richard did something I'd never seen a lawyer do in court. He physically grabbed his client's arm. Mr. Chen, you need to look at this right now. Marcos finally turned to look at his lawyer. Something in Richard's expression must have gotten through, because the confidence on Marcos's face flickered. He took the papers Richard was holding. I watched my husband's face as he read, watched the confusion spread, watched him flip pages, looking for something that would make this make sense, watched the exact moment when understanding hit. His hands started shaking. The papers rustled loudly in the quiet courtroom. This can't be right, he said, his voice barely audible. Judge Morrison looked up from his desk. Is there a problem, Mr. Chen? Marcos stood abruptly. These numbers, they're wrong. This is... He turned to look at me, and for the first time in 2 years, he really saw me. Not the broken wife. Not the defeated woman. He saw something else. Something that made him understand. You knew, he said, his voice raw. You knew about all of it. I met his eyes calmly. After 20 years of marriage, after 2 years of carrying this secret, I allowed myself one moment of complete honesty. I was your CFO for 18 years, Marcos. I knew about everything. Your Honor, Richard Brighton stood, his professional composure cracking. I need to request a continuance. My client needs time to review. Your Honor, Patricia interrupted smoothly. Mr. Chen has had ample time to review all documents. He was advised by counsel to conduct an independent financial audit and declined. I have documentation. She produced the waiver Richard had prepared, with Marcos's signature. Judge Morrison reviewed the waiver, reviewed the liability disclosure attached to the settlement, looked at Marcos, who was standing there like a man who'd just been hit by a truck. Mr. Chen, the judge said slowly. Did you sign a waiver declining to conduct a financial review of these assets? Marco stared at the document like it was in a foreign language. Yes, but I didn't understand. Is that your signature? A long, painful pause. Yes. Then you acknowledged the risk and proceeded anyway. Judge Morrison's voice was firm. Mr. Chen, these are your assets, your business, your mortgages, your obligations. The liability disclosure is clear and comprehensive. Your wife has not hidden anything. She's simply agreeing to let you keep what's yours. But the house alone is underwater by... Marcos couldn't even finish the sentence. Nearly $1 million, I said quietly. Along with $375 million in business debts, maxed credit lines, unpaid taxes, and various other obligations. It's all documented in Section 7 of the Liability Disclosure. Page 42 through 68. The courtroom was silent. Marco stood there, papers shaking in his hands, his entire world collapsing in real time. I want to withdraw the agreement, he finally managed. I didn't understand what I was signing. This isn't fair. Judge Morrison shook his head. Mr. Chen, you were represented by experienced counsel. You were advised to investigate further and declined in writing. You signed documents stating you understood all terms. Your wife has done nothing illegal or unethical. She's agreed to give you exactly what you asked for. The gavel came down. The settlement is approved. Mr. Chen, you have full ownership of all marital assets and full responsibility for all associated liabilities. Mrs. Chen, you have your cash settlement and are released from all marital debts. This marriage is dissolved. I stood, gathered my purse, smoothed my dress. Marcos was still standing there, frozen, as the reality of what he'd done crashed over him in waves. You planned this, he said, his voice hollow. For how long? 2 years, I told him. Since I found out about Caroline. Since I discovered what you'd been hiding. Since I realized that the man I married had become someone who saw me as disposable. Helena, we can fix this. We can... Fix what, Marcos? The debt? The business that's about to collapse? Or the marriage you destroyed 2 years ago? I picked up my copy of the settlement documents. You said you wanted the house and the business. You said you wanted everything. I gave you exactly what you asked for. I walked out of that courtroom and didn't look back. Behind me, I could hear Marcos yelling, Richard trying to explain the legal reality, the judge calling for order. But I was already gone, stepping out into the June sunshine, breathing free air for the first time in 2 years. Patricia caught up with me in the parking lot. Helena, she said, and there was genuine respect in her voice. That was the most patient, perfect revenge I've ever seen in 30 years of practice. I smiled at her. It wasn't revenge. It was justice. He wanted to take everything and leave me with nothing. I just let him have exactly that. The collapse was spectacular. Within 3 weeks, Caroline moved out of the mansion. She'd finally looked at the financial reality of what she was getting into. The successful architect with the beautiful house was actually a soon-to-be bankrupt man, drowning in debt. She left a note. Some women chase money. I wasn't one of them. Within 6 weeks, the bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on the house. Marcos tried to sell it, but you can't sell something you owe more on than it's worth. Not without the bank's cooperation, which they weren't inclined to give. Within 3 months, Chen & Associates Architecture filed for bankruptcy. Vendors were lined up with lawsuits. The IRS had frozen assets. Clients had fled to other firms. The company Marcos had built over 14 years, the one I'd helped him build, was gone. Within 5 months, Marcos was living in a small apartment, working as a contract architect for one of his former competitors, most of his income garnished for debt payments. The mansion was seized. The cars were repossessed. Everything he'd fought for, Everything he'd thought he was winning was gone. I took my $80,000 settlement, added it to what I already had in storage, and opened my own financial consulting firm. Winters Financial Advisory, specializing in helping small businesses and individuals navigate complex financial situations. Turns out 18 years of managing someone else's finances translates well into professional expertise. Sophie started college that fall, her tuition fully covered by the trust I'd established. David had 2 more years of high school, but his future was secure too. The inheritance my mother had left me, the money Marcos had dismissed as a little nest egg, would give both my children opportunities he could never take away. Marcos tried to contact me several times, pleading, angry, desperate. I didn't respond. We had nothing left to say to each other. Our communication went through lawyers for custody matters regarding David, and that was all. The kids eventually understood what had happened. Not all at once, but gradually. They saw their father's empire crumble. They learned about the debts, the lies, the affair. They figured out that I hadn't been defeated. I'd been strategic. One evening, about 4 months after the divorce, Sophie came to my new office. It was small but professional, in a good building, downtown. I'd worked hard to make it feel both welcoming and credible. "Mom," she said, sitting across from my desk, "I get it now. What you did. Why you did it." I looked at my daughter, 18 years old and so much wiser than I'd been at her age. "And?" "Dad called me yesterday. He wants me to ask you for help. He thinks if you explain to the banks that the debt wasn't your fault, that you didn't know about it, maybe they'll work with him differently." I waited, curious about what she'd say next. "I told him no," Sophie continued. "I told him that you spent 20 years helping him build his life, and he threw you away the minute he didn't need you anymore. I told him that he made his choices, and now he has to live with them." I felt tears sting my eyes. Not sad tears, proud tears. "Thank you, sweetheart." "Did you really plan all of this? For 2 years?" "I documented his choices for 2 years," I corrected. "I didn't create the debt or the lies. I just made sure that when he demanded everything, he actually got everything, including the consequences." Sophie nodded slowly. "Grandma would be proud. She always said a woman should protect herself." She did. And she was right. That evening, I sat in my small apartment, the one that was mine, really mine, and thought about the journey. From 22-year-old bride to 42-year-old divorcee, from financial analyst to unpaid CFO to independent business owner, from devoted wife to strategic adversary to free woman. Marcos had wanted to discard me like I was nothing. He'd thought that because he'd built the business, designed the house, earned the success, that he owned everything. He'd forgotten that I'd been there from the beginning, that I'd funded his dream, that I'd managed his finances, that I'd known him better than he knew himself. He'd underestimated me so thoroughly that he'd signed away his own future without even reading what he was agreeing to. And that, more than anything else, was his biggest mistake. My name is Helena Winters. I'm 42 years old. I dedicated 20 years to a marriage that ended with my husband trying to leave me with nothing. Instead, I left him with exactly what he asked for. Everything. The house, the business, and every single dollar of debt that came with them. And me? I have my children, my inheritance, my business, and my freedom. Some people might call it revenge. I call it the most expensive lesson in respect that Marcos Chen will ever receive. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. Sometimes the quietest victories are the most satisfying. If this story spoke to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, remember, never underestimate the woman who's been doing your math. She knows exactly what you're worth,